from the Institute of Employment Rights. He's been advancing workers' rights issues around the European agenda for a very long time and has often come to Scotland to share that with us, and I really welcome him to speak to you today. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for everybody coming today. I mean, it's amazing that there are actually so many people here. So, can you hear me okay at the back?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think I've got half an hour, so I'll try not to go beyond half an hour and just deal with two things. One is the question of Brexit and the immediate implications for employment rights, and the second is in a sense, the opportunities perhaps that Brexit might create for a new non-Tory government at some time in the future. So let's start off with the Brexit and employment rights. So the issue here, I think, just a number of points. The first point is to say, of course, that many of the employment rights that we currently have are there as a direct result of the demands of the European Union. And very often, much of this legislation that we have, the protections we have, has been introduced despite the objections of British governments, which historically have worked hard in Brussels to water down many of these rights. So the rights that we are talking about at the moment are many and varied, and we're looking at things like working time, including paid holidays. We're looking at things like TUPE, which is a direct consequence of an EU directive, clearly very important for Unison and other unions in the public sector. We're looking at things like information consultation, and in particular collective redundancies, and we're looking at the whole raft of discrimination law, and which goes back to a number of equality directives and indeed to provisions in the treaty itself. So, you know, whatever your position on the EU, and it is a fact that our domestic employment law, or labour law, is based to a large extent on this inheritance that we've got from Brussels. And that goes back really to 1975 at least, maybe even before that. I mean, depends on how you calculate it. So that would be the first thing I'd say. The second thing I would say, however, is that so far as I can tell, the European project on social rights has died. And if you look at the legislation, so there was a fairly busy programme of legislation in Europe from 1975 right through to 2010, with a brief break during the Thatcher period. But since 2010, there has been since the agency worked, 28 actually, 2008, has been actually nothing of any significance. So in a sense, the legislative programme, in a sense the programme of creating new workers' rights, has come to an end, so far as I can tell. And the focus in Brussels is now very different. And what has happened in Brussels is something which has taken place beyond the public eye. I mean, it's not a secret, but it's just not spoken about. And there has been a switch of emphasis in Brussels, in policy-making circles, from what is called the social policy chapter of the treaty, which is in Title 10 of the treaty, to what is called Title 8, which is the economic policy chapter of the treaty. And what is happening through the economic policy chapter of the treaty is that there is a degree of supervision going on of each individual member state by the European Commission. And what the Commission is telling member states is that there are certain objective economic targets that you have got to meet. And there are certain things that you have got to do in terms of your national law and policy, certain changes you've got to make in order to meet these economic targets, which are directed at greater flexibility in their terms. And the two things, so every year, these, the 27, I mean it doesn't happen every year to all the 27, but increasingly more and more countries in the European Union are being told there are certain changes that you've got to implement. And what are the changes in terms of employment rights? Well, there are two changes that have to be made in particular. So if you just look at these reports which come out every year addressed to individual countries, and they're on the website, but people don't look at them. And these countries are being told that you've got to decentralise your collective bargaining arrangements, so that the effect will be that fewer people will be covered by collective agreements. And the second thing you've got to do is you've got to deregulate your employment protection measures to make it easier for employers, in their terms, to hire and fire workers. And so what has happened is that this programme kind of started on the fringes, the eastern and southern fringes of the Union, and is now coming closer and closer and closer to the centre. So why are we having these problems in France over the summer, where French unions were out on the streets of Paris during the Euro competition to protest about labour laws under a socialist, French socialist government? The answer is because the French socialist government was responding to pressure from Brussels to decentralise collective bargaining arrangements, which would lead to a decline in the levels of coverage of collective bargaining in the French state. And what the agenda is, the great irony of all of this, is that while we go into Brexit, the European Commission has effectively bought the British economic model and is now seeking to impose the British model on the rest of the European Union. And the British model in terms of employment rights is one of a highly decentralised collective bargaining system, because we have the lowest level, one of the lowest levels of collective bargaining coverage in the European Union, at about 20%. Only one country which has levels lower than us, which is Lithuania. And we also have one of the most highly deregulated labour relations systems in terms of employment protection measures, including, for example, the tribunal fees, which effectively completely deregulate the system altogether. But this is the direction of travel of the European Union at the present time. And that's, in a sense, this message is not getting out. In a sense, it is true that we've got all these employment rights, which come from the European Union, but it's also true that the European Union is not now legislating across the Union. It is now targeting countries individually and saying, you've got to deregulate, you've got to decentralise, you've got to liberalise, in their terms, the so-called labour market, a term which we on the left should never ever use. People are not commodities. We should not be talking about labour markets. But that is their language, and that is what they want to do, is to deregulate, decentralise, and become more like us. So the question then for us, I think, is that as it looks like we're going to come out, I mean, I don't see any way back from despite the fact that Scotland may have voted differently, I don't see any way back from the decision to Brexit on the 23rd of June. And the question is that even though, for us, for me at least, is that even though I think the European social model is dead for various reasons, it's not just the new economic policy, it's also the influence of free trade, the influence of the currency crisis in 2008, 2010. So all of these things are contributing to this obviously the great death of the social model. But the issue is that, like every death, or like most deaths, or many deaths, there is an inheritance. And the inheritance here is that great body of rights that were created between 1975 and 2010, which are now part of our domestic law. And the question for us really is how we're going to protect these from erosion. And I think for many on the left, that will be one of the priorities. How are we going to protect these existing rights, even though there ain't going to be any more, but how are we going to protect these existing rights from erosion? And the issue, I think, is, we've got David Davis, I think May herself, saying, well, don't worry, you just don't worry, little people, it'll be okay, we're not going to take away your rights. But the question then is, well, what does that actually mean? I mean, the question is, what does Brexit mean, is one issue. But the other question is, for us, well, what does it mean when they say that they're not going to take away our rights? Well, what does that actually mean in practice? And the answer to that question, I think, depends on what the kind of Brexit is that we're going to have. I mean, if it's going to be the so-called hard Brexit, whereby we come out altogether, there is no commitment to free movement or any of these other, no access to the single market. If there's going to be a hard Brexit, then it may be in the short term that these rights are guaranteed, but there'll be a number of questions that we will have, because the first thing is, of course, is that it will simply freeze what's there already. And if there should be in the future any improvement of the European social model, then these new rights will not apply automatically in this country. So in a sense it will freeze what's there, but any improvements, if they do come, I don't know if they will, but if they do come, of course we won't get access to them. But secondly, what hard Brexit will mean is that we don't get access to the European Court of Justice. And that would be, it's significant. I mean, I'm not saying it's a disaster, but it's significant. And one example of the significance is, for example, on working time. So why is it that part-time workers or workers on fixed-term contracts have a right to a paid holiday? Well, the British government, when they implemented the Working Time Directive, denied a lot of workers the right to a paid holiday. It was the European Court of Justice that said, no, these people are entitled to these rights as well. So you're going to lose the right to go to the court and the opportunity to go to the court, but the court may inflate some of the terms of the rights which have been incorporated. So you're going to lose a bit of that, I think. So that opportunity, a gap will grow between, say, working time rights in this country and working time rights in the rest of the EU, in the sense that we will be stuck with the decisions of our court, which notoriously are not very friendly to workers' rights, which is why so many cases have to go to the European Court of Justice. So, and then the third thing, so in a sense, there'd be we don't get the benefit of any improvements under, should there be any, under a hard Brexit. We don't get access to the European Court of Justice, so we have perhaps a second-tier category of European rights which will survive here. That will be our inheritance. And thirdly, there is no guarantee. She may say that in general terms, these rights will be guaranteed, but there is no guarantee that they won't start chipping away, that the agencies won't start saying, well, we want some modification of the agency workers regulations. Some of the other big corporations will say, we want some modification of the collective redundancies provisions. That we don't see some chipping away, turning back on working time, let's go back to the exclusion of part-time workers from paid holiday pay. So you can give a general commitment that rights will be protected, but that's not a commitment to saying that there will be no changes whatsoever to any of these existing provisions. So I think the first point is, with a hard Brexit, we need to be very vigilant about what they actually mean when they say that workers' rights will be protected. I don't believe it, because I just don't think they can make that kind of commitment in these political circumstances. Now, the other thing, of course, is the other option is there might be some kind of soft Brexit or some kind of intermediate Brexit, which some people might support that because it would offer better protection for the inheritance from Europe. But the problem, I think, with a soft Brexit or an intermediate Brexit is that will require, which will give us access to the single market, which is what some businesses want. But the problem with that, I think, is that a soft Brexit or something in between will, in a sense, require them to accept some measure of free movement of labour, which takes us into the question of immigration, which, in a sense, was one of the issues on which they claim they won the referendum. And I think it would also take us into the other issue of access to the European Court, because I don't see Europeans accepting any arrangement other than that which currently applies in Norway. Norway has an arrangement with the European Union, but they've got to accept a lot of this European law and access to a court equivalent to the European Court of Justice. Now, I think if you just think about the hard right on the Tory party, again, this is a non-starter for them. They want to get rid of the supervisory role of the European Court because they see it as something which confronts their idea of sovereignty of the United Kingdom. So I think, I mean, who knows? You like that, you basically stick your finger in the air, see which way the wind's blowing. But my guess is that the demands for a soft or an intermediate Brexit are going to be too hard for this government to deliver because of the pressure from their own party and their own side. And the most likely outcome is going to be some kind of hard Brexit, maybe a hard Brexit with soft edges, but it's going to be a hard Brexit which is going to put workers' rights at some kind of, under some kind of threat. And we will soon find out just how serious is the promise that workers' rights will be protected. And my sense is that not all promises are kept. So, anyway, so that would be, I mean, just very quickly, where I think we are on that. And the other issue then is, there are people, there is a view that Brexit provides opportunities, and it provides opportunities for a new kind of thinking about employment rights. And in a sense, I think that's right, in the sense that we've got an opportunity now, both in Scotland and in the United Kingdom as a whole. And a lot of that expression of optimism is coming from some of the work that Corbyn and MacDonald are doing. And I just want to say something about that, in the sense what an alternative could look like. And in a sense, for trade unions, I think what they will be talking about is about reintegrating trade unions into the economic and political structures of the state after the exclusion, effective exclusion since 1979. And I think there are essentially 2 or 3 key elements to this. And the first of these, I think, is that, I mean, if you look at this country, the United Kingdom, I think we're one of the only countries in the world where the interests of workers are not represented in government. There are 31 million working people in this country. And there is nobody who sits around the cabinet table who speaks for their interests, who represents their voice in government. And the idea, I think, is that, you know, in the past, in this country, we had a cabinet minister, a senior cabinet minister, heading a big government department, which was the Ministry of Labour. And the responsibility of the Secretary of State for Labour was to represent the interests of working people in government. And at the moment, rather than to be some kind of appendix to the business department, as was the case under Blair and Brown. And so, you know, the little minister, the little office in biz, as it then was, I mean, it's outrageous. So the idea is that there should be in government a minister who will speak for working people, as we had from 1916 right through until the late 1970s. And in the past, people say, well, who would this person be? And I say, well, look at in the past who these ministers of Labour were. I mean, the most preeminent, of course, was Elie Bevan, who had been General Secretary of the T&G before he went into government. Other holders of the office of Minister of Labour in the past in this country were Barbara Castle, another preeminent figure in the Labour movement. And before that, Margaret Bonfield, who'd been an official in the General Municipal Workers' Union, as it then was. And then after the war, under the Attlee government, George Isaacs, who'd been an official in one of the print unions. Well, that, in a sense, is what we need in government. Somebody with a trade union background who's going to actually speak for, represent the interests of workers in the cabinet table, and to speak up for workers against the demands of business when they're being pressed by biz or any other government department, most of the other government departments at the moment, which represent these commercial, corporate, global interests. So that's the first thing, and it's interesting that Corbyn last week, as part of his reshuffle, created a position of Shadow Minister of Labour. There is a Minister of Labour to shadow, but we've now got a Shadow Minister of Labour, but no Minister of Labour on the government side. So there's a message to May. Actually, May stands up at the Tory Party conference and tells us she's for the workers. Well, let's have the workers' voice in government. The first thing you could do would be to appoint a minister who could actually articulate these interests and these demands and actually stand up for workers around the cabinet table and in government generally. But the second thing, so it's one thing to have, I mean, the minister in place, actually to speak for all of us. The second thing is actually to look again at the role of trade unions. And what has happened since 1979 in this country, and this country we had a conversation earlier, is that the trade union role has very subtly changed. Now, I'm old enough to remember a different. When I started work, sorry you've heard this so many times, but when I started work in 1978, I was one of I joined the union. First thing I did join the union, and I was one of 82%. 82% of the British workforce covered by a collective agreement. Even in universities, there was a collective agreement, which applied to everybody. It regulated wages, all terms and conditions. Today, that has fallen to probably less than 20%. So in the course of my lifetime, my working lifetime, the level of collective bargaining has fallen from 82% to about 20%. I don't think it was my fault. But that is what has happened. And it tells us a lot. That tells us a lot about the declining role of trade unions over that 40-year period. And it tells us a lot about the number of lives that we no longer touch. And we have had a fetish, I think, for the last 15, 20 years about organising and membership. And that's important. It's important that we have high numbers of members, it's important that we engage in organising activity. But it's more important that we actually touch the lives of all workers. That what we do has an impact and an influence on the terms and conditions of employment of everybody. And what is more important to me than membership density is collective bargaining coverage. Because the more people who are covered by our agreements suggests the greater influence that we have. That means the more people's lives we are touching, the more people we are protecting, even though we may be irritated by the fact that they're not members of the union. So in a sense, I think we've wasted 20 years by focusing too much on organising and membership drives, which are, if we look at the American experience, we know are unsustainable. And the focus should be not just bottom up, but it's got to be top down as well. In the sense we've got to build the structures and institutions within which the unions can operate without relying exclusively on simply building up the membership. We look at the States, where in a sense where we got this model from. The American coverage, collective bargaining coverage, is only 10% now. One in 10 workers covered by a collective agreement. And that's where we're heading, very, very quickly. And that's what we've got to get away from. So, the question then is, what the agenda is to have a voice in government. Two, it is to redefine the role of trade unions. And so, redefining the role of trade unions to give trade unions a voice at national level in the development of economic policy through what has been suggested as a new national economic forum in which trade unions participate as equal partners with government and business in the development of a progressive economic policy and agenda, but secondly also changing the way in which trade unions are seen. So we return to a system which I entered, in which trade unions performed a role as regulators. We regulate the lives of working people. We make the rules by which people's lives are governed, as opposed to the system which has been imposed upon us by successive governments recently, whereby we simply represent people. We've become representative bodies. We act for small groups of people or individuals when they've got a grievance. But that is not the traditional trade union role. It's part of it. But the traditional trade union role through collective bargaining was to be regulatory bodies which regulate terms and conditions of employment for workers and sectors and industries as a whole. So we saturate the economy with our rules and agreements. And that is where we've got to get back to. And that is, in a sense, why we need a progressive government. Not just to put us into government, give us a voice in government, but also to change the way in which we operate. And to be more ambitious, more progressive, more outward-looking in terms of our activities. So the pitch is from a regulatory style of trade unionism, the kind you see in Germany, for example, or France. And less of the representative style of trade unionism that we see here now. And we see in the United States, we see in Canada, and in other English-speaking countries, where levels of collective bargaining density are pitifully low and falling. So that is the second thing. So we've got to get a voice in government who can do these things for us. Secondly, we've got to change the way in which we perceive ourselves and the way in which we operate. And thirdly, we need the state to help us to rebuild these collective bargaining structures. Now, what has happened since 1979, the reason why collective bargaining has collapsed in this country is because we've switched the way in which we do collective bargaining. Now, in the 1930s, when we came out of the Depression, we came out of the Depression, 1929-30, how are we going to deal with the problems in the 1930s? Well, it was not a Labour government that came up with this radical idea that the way out of this problem is to build collective bargaining structures through joint industrial councils. It was a national government led by Ramsay MacDonald of all people, who passed on a baton to Stanley Baldwin of all people. And their idea was that we've got to build up collective bargaining structures which will apply across every sector, across every industry, and we saturate the coverage. So every worker is covered by a collective agreement. And the answer is, well, why would they do that? And the answer is because, the question is why would they do that? The answer is because they knew at the time they had, in order for the benefit of economic recovery, they had to raise wages. And they had to equalise incomes. They had to put money into workers' pockets so workers would start spending money in order to buy the houses they wanted to build, or to rent the homes they wanted to build, to buy all the other goods and services they wanted to create in order to stimulate a demand for stronger economic performance. So it wasn't a radical idea from the left that actually created our collective bargaining structures. It was common sense from a liberal economist called John Maynard Keynes, who so convinced the other political parties that this was the progressive way forward, and in fact not just the progressive way forward, the only rational way forward. Otherwise you get into this cycle of doom and gloom and depression. So in a sense you've got to equalise incomes, raise wages in order to spend your way out of these economic problems. So, but that requires a state, and it requires a state to recognise that that is the way forward, and requires a state to take the initiative to tell employers this is what you've got to do in order to meet the demands that we have of you. It's not just in Theresa May's case putting the odd worker on the board of the odd company. It's about the state taking responsibility to build the structures within which workers can operate effectively, in which terms and conditions can be set by collective agreements. And the benefit of that is that if we get terms and conditions by collective bargaining, it takes away the need to rely on legislation for these terms and conditions of employment. And that's a much more efficient way of regulating working life. Give it to unions the power to make the agreements, but also the power to enforce them without the need to have lawyers and courts and judges and the expense which is normally associated with these processes. So that is, in a sense, I mean, I see my time's up. So, I mean, just two things. One is, on Brexit, there is an issue, and we need to, there is an inheritance. Okay, the social Europe may be dead, but there is an inheritance we need to protect. In the sense that there's an inheritance of rights, we need to protect these rights. And we've got to make sure that steps are taken to protect them and that they're not washed away as part of this process of negotiation. And these promises which are made by Davis and May, we've got to make sure that these are meaningful promises. And the second point is, well, you know, from the ashes, where do we go? And what I'm saying to you is that, you know, we can continue the way we are, we can continue in this negative cycle of decline, of greater inequality, even lower wages, even poorer terms and conditions of employment, or we've got a choice. We've got a choice. There is a better way forward, in the sense which gives to workers a much greater role in the process of government, in the way in which terms and conditions of employment are regulated, and in the governance of their own working lives through collective bargaining. We've got a choice. We had that choice in the 1930s, and we made that choice in our interests. A different choice was made for us in 1979, and many of us went along with it. But we've got to make a different choice today. Thanks very much.